Welcome, humble adventurers, to my realm of knowledge and mystery. Here, in my cursed library, are endless tomes and scrolls on the darkest and evilest foes in all the realms. Be they from Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, the many worlds of darkness, or any realm in between. Welcome to the Dastardly decimal system. I'm your caretaker of the corrupt, the librarian, Castor Cain. And supervising as always is Vega, the cat. Eldrith, the betrayer. Eldrith was once a human paladin. She wasn't a stunning beauty. She had more a face that had seen combat, and hands that had worked out every single day of her life. Now, she was a reborn, undead blackguard. Eldrith is often seen dressed in slate gray full-plate armor, and fights with a sword and shield. She has the ability to smite, and uses magical auras to strengthen her allies on the battlefield. She fights with a dancing blade that will slash and spin across the battlefield, while she summons bursts and blasts of magical lightning to damage her foes. As a leader, Eldrith is a prideful commander who has an unbeaten streak in combat. This has led her to believe that she is deserving of far more power, praise, and worth than she currently gets. This has even gone as far as to morph her thoughts into a delusion of her true power and her true rulership of Baldur's Gate. Sometimes, a person's evil actions are so impactful that it forever taints the history of that person. In the case of Eldrith, her actions have essentially erased her last name from the minds of all. She has worn many titles, but now she is known as Eldrith, the Betrayer. Eldrith grew up in Baldur's Gate and joined the City Watch at a young age. She quickly grew in strength, skill, and stature, and very swiftly rose to the rank of general. She was given command of the Company of the Crescent Blade. Eldrith was a masterful tactician who focused not only on her individual martial prowess, but also made sure her troops were trained far better than those of any other companies. This all contributed to Eldrith never losing a battle that she commanded. Eldrith's victories were well known and well documented. She led her forces to victory in the first and last seasons of the Sundering War, the Crescent Port Siege, and finally, in the defense against the Black Horde. Her undefeated streak caused her pride to rapidly grow until it consumed her, warping her sense of thought and perception. She began to view all of Baldur's Gate as her domain. It was a city under her rulership. She never attempted a coup, of course, believing herself a benevolent ruler who allowed the Grand Dukes to exist as figureheads. She knew that they would never go to war without consulting their greatest general, and they would always do as they were told and take their side in battle. And in truth, it worked like that, until the day they dared to disobey her. In 1235 DR, hundreds of orc armies and orc clans came together in the Sword Coast, forming the largest orc horde in the history of Faerun. This army, the Black Horde, began to assault numerous settlements in the north before moving south to threaten the kingdoms there. They laid siege to Waterdeep, killed the Pasha of Columnport, claimed the city of Silvery Moon before placing its gaze upon Baldur's Gate. Fearing for the city's safety, the Lord's Alliance turned to Eldrith and her company. The Company of the Crescent Blade rode out and assaulted the Horde. Legions upon legions of orcs faced them, each heavily armed, filled with bloodlust, and experienced in battle. They outnumbered the company 5-1, but Eldrith cared not. She had never lost before, and wasn't intending to start that day. She was victorious, but at a great cost. She split the Horde and scattered the orcs, but lost nearly half of her own company in the process. Eldrith's pride would not take this. She was desperate to pursue the orcs, twisting her own logic into believing that if even one orc of the Black Horde remained, then they would return and attack again. The only way to ensure Baldur's Gate's safety was to slaughter them all and make sure they never came back. But the Grand Duke said no. Her company was lessened in numbers, her soldiers were weary, and the people of the city wanted no more death. Eldrith was furious. How dare they deny her? This was her city. She was only trying to protect it. Disobeying commands, she took her company and rode out after the orcs. They tracked the beasts and cornered the orcs in a narrow defile, cutting off their retreat, and began to attack. They thought this an easy win, but the orcs, like trapped animals, fought more ferociously than ever before. They overwhelmed Eldrith's outnumbered and tired warriors. She sent word to Baldur's Gate demanding reinforcements, but the dukes simply refused. Eldrith's forces were slaughtered, and she was forced to retreat, being given her first loss ever. Eldrith returned to the city, but was stopped at the gate and denied entrance for her and her troops. She was told, for her disobedience, that she and her troops were banished from the city. Eldrith was beyond furious. How could she be banished from Baldur's Gate? From her city? Suddenly, the truth, or her version of it, became clear to the Paladin. The Grand Dukes were corrupt. They were the villainous cancer at the heart of Baldur's Gate, and it was her job as a Paladin to cut them out, to liberate the city, to save everyone. Taking what few troops she had left, she led them in an attack on Baldur's Gate, fueling her fanatically loyal troops with stories of liberation and tales of righteous duty. They fought against the city, but were slaughtered even further. Eldrith signaled a retreat and escaped into the marsh, her second loss in a row. She was labeled the traitoress of swords and villainized across the city. Every citizen feared her return, her next attack, and demanded that the Grand Dukes put an end to her threat. In a case of vicious irony, the Grand Dukes believed that even if a single member of Eldrith's company existed, then they would return to attack again. The only way to ensure the safety of Baldur's Gate was to slaughter them all. They pursued the company into the marsh, slaughtering each and every member until only Eldrith remained. They knew of her skills in combat and dared not face her. Instead, they cowardly executed her with a volley of crossbow bolts. This marked the end of Eldrith. Or at least, it should have. Be it by rage, pride, or the machinations of something sinister. But somehow, Eldrith survived. She defied death by sheer force of will alone, and somehow, she reached into the wells of magic to sustain her, and slowly began the creation of the Onyx Tower. The Onyx Tower was a powerful, evil building located in the marsh of Trelimber in the Western Heartlands. The tower was said to drink in light, a building not even the moonlight would touch. It was a black kiss or a serpent's bite upon the land. While existing on the material plane, it had links to the elemental planes, created out of the elemental foundations. The tower had no entrance and could only be accessed by a magical gate. The tower was controlled by the Onyx Heart, located in the Plains of Shadows. Now in control of the tower, and no longer bound by age, Eldrith began the slow and methodical planning to get her revenge on Baldur's Gate. She began by getting together some allies. One of the earliest to swear loyalty was Mordok Solanmare, the king of vampires. With his charismatic help, she spent the next century building her power, collecting arcane artifacts, and forming alliances with drow, lizardmen, and the thieves of Xantem's guild. This would become her deadly alliance. At some point, over the 150-ish years, between her death and her attack, her mind became warped even further. Gone were any notions of liberation and savior. Gone were any notions of cutting free the cancer that ruled Baldur's Gate. Now, she just wanted blind, furious revenge, and she wanted to wipe Baldur's Gate off of the map for good. Eldrith began her attacks using the Orb of the Undead to raise the dead from their crypts and sewers located beneath the city. Then she began to assault the city with monsters. This was only a misdirection, as her plan was to open a portal within Baldur's Gate and invade directly from within. Soon, Baldur's Gate would fear the return of Eldrith, the Betrayer. In the world of Faerun, the butterfly effect is a very real thing. Too often, small events begin a chain that lead to greater ones. When Xantam thieves robbed a trio of adventurers, they didn't expect that this would set those heroes on a path to stopping Eldrith. The heroes started with the Thieves Guild, then moved to the undead in the sewers, before facing off against the Drow, an Ice Dragon, and even the Lizard Man armies. Once they found an entrance into the Onyx Tower, they fought upwards until facing off against Eldrith herself. The battle was fierce. Eldrith's skills were unmatched during the Black Horde, but now, 139 years later, they were beyond approach. Even the most skilled of warriors was barely able to keep their eye on her blade to track its movements. And those daring enough to raise a shield to block it found their arm instantly numb. Yet be it by luck or the divine blessing of some deity, but this trio somehow bested the warrior. As the former general lay on the stone floor, bleeding out and dying, a moment of clarity struck her. In that moment, without pride or anger clouding her mind, Eldrith was filled with a moment of remorse, repenting her actions in her final breath. Seconds later, the Onyx Tower crumbled. In a storm of fire and lightning, Eldrith died her second death. Eldrith will forever be known not for her service to Baldur's Gate, but instead for her betrayal of it. She wanted nothing more than to destroy the city, but it was a desire that led to her eventual death. Twice. While the darkness of pride that consumed her cannot be overlooked, but if we dig deeper, we must ask ourselves, what is the lesson to be learned from her actions? Is Eldrith a reminder that regardless of how much success and renown you have gained as a soldier, that we must never forget that a soldier's duty is always to serve the people? Or is she a lesson and a reminder that pride has no place on the battlefield? Mordok, the King of Vampires. Mordok Salanmare is a vampire. He has the ability to climb walls, charm a person, turn into a bat, and even transform into mist to escape death. As the King of Vampires, he also has the ability to summon shadows, thralls, other vampires, and even flocks of bats to fight by his side. He wears ivory white robes that protect him in battle and allow him to dash across the battlefield. He fights with a vampiric rapier, one that with each hit will rob its opponents of its health and use it to heal himself. Little is known about Mordoc Saint-Lemaire's origins, but often is the case with old creatures. For those unaffected by time, their lives seem to outlast recorded history, leading to lost facts about their birth or even what their lives were like before becoming a vampire. And in the case of some very, very old creatures, they themselves have also forgotten. Written history only seems to take notice of Mordoc when he became the self-appointed king of vampires. With an army of vamps, nightwalkers, and nightshades by his side, he marched into an old battlefield in the western heartlands known as the Battle of Bones. There, on the edge of the battlefield, he built the Keep of the Pale Knight, where he and his vampiric servants lived with him. He built the Keep of the Pale Knight, where he and his vampiric citizens lived with him. Chief among his armies was his second-in-command, the vampire known as Zanhast. This armored vampire protected the king against all threats, including when an assassin named Karn came to kill him. To his subjects, Mordoc was a charismatic master, with a series of plans meant to better each and every one of their lives. The vampires were downtrodden, cast out, but Mordoc was going to make their voices heard. Mordoc was going to give them a place to live. Mordoc was beholden to no man. He did not have to play the games of other kings. Mordoc was going to make Faerun great again. This, however, was a lie. In truth, the Vampire King served another master, one in Mulhorand known only as the Giver of Eternity. Together they were moving towards a singular goal, the destruction of Baldur's Gate. When the Onyx Tower appeared in the marsh of Che-Limber, Mordoc saw great potential in its powerful magics, but it was being wasted in the hands of a spurned soldier. Luckily, Mordoc was a patient soul. He falsely swore allegiance to Eldrith the Betrayer, using his charm to provide her with new armies and allies within the Drow, the Lizard Folk, and even a few dragons. He helped her build her deadly alliance and waited for the day he could betray her and gain control of the tower. When a trio of heroes defeated Eldrith and destroyed the tower, Mordoc was giddy with glee. He reached out to his master in Mulhorand and apologized for the delay. He promised them that Baldur's Gate would be destroyed very soon. Many factions wanted to rebuild the Onyx Tower, like the Zentarum, the Harpers, the Red Fang Marauders, and even a red dragon known as the Red Queen. But none of them knew what Mordoc did. The Onyx Tower could be destroyed over and over and over again. But as long as the Onyx Heart still existed, an artifact that was built in the Plane of Shadows, then the tower could be rebuilt. As the other factions feuded between each other, Mordoc traveled to the Plane of Shadows and took control of the Heart. While there, he also found a pleasant surprise. Trapped in the Plane of Shadows were the original 3 heroes that had slain Eldrith. He quickly bested the tired and injured trio, took them hostage, and locked them up in his Pale Keep. As many horrors and evils that exist in Faerun, there seems to be an abundance of people willing to step up and be heroes. So while the original 3 heroes were trapped and locked away, a company of 5 new heroes formed. They began working with the factions, traveling to each elemental plane in order to reactivate the elemental foundations, the magical source that powered the tower. The heroes were doing this so the forces of good could gain control of the tower, but unknown to them, they were unwittingly aiding Mordok in his plans. With the Onyx heart under his control, and power flowing back towards it, Mordok used the magic to rebuild the tower in the Battle of Bones. He renamed it Mordok's Tower, and it signaled the end of Baldur's Gate. When the Company of Five returned to Baldur's Gate, they expected to do so with conflict between the various factions. Instead, they found a surprising alliance being formed. Harpers, Zentarum, and the Red Fangs had all put aside their feuds, for now, and they were going to work together to bring an end to Mordok. The alliance began with an attack on Mordok's home. The heroes infiltrated the Pale Keep and attacked the vampiric forces that lay there. After destroying numerous undead, they eventually reached Mordok. Now, a vampire is a formidable foe, and the king of vampires more so, but even he was no match for 5 heavily armed heroes. Injured, Mordok fled to the tower and began the final stage of his plan, moving the tower directly into Baldur's Gate. The Company of Five freed the original 3 and united forces. Now a company of 8, they returned to Baldur's Gate. What they found was chaos. Using the Onyx heart, Mordok transformed chunks of Baldur's Gate populace into zombies, consuming their energy and growing stronger with each soul. Those that resisted the transformation were fed on by vampires, turning some allies into undead killers. For a month, this undead siege occurred, with more and more citizens being transformed each and every day. All the while, Mulhorand allies started teleporting to the tower, granting them access to Baldur's Gate. The Company of 8 fought a ground war against the vampiric army, slaying each until they eventually destroyed Zanhast. Meanwhile, the Harpers and the Zentarum had found a way into the tower. Knowing this crisis would only end with Mordok's death, the Company of 8 ventured inwards. The battle against Mordok was beyond difficult. The Onyx heart was swelling with magic, and the Vampire King was siphoning it into himself. Some historians say that on that night, Mordok had almost as much power as a god. Mordok summoned his army of vamps, shade, nightwalkers, and nightshades to assault the 8 heroes. He teleported around the battlefield in a puff of black smoke, appearing behind a hero only to strike with his life-stealing blade. He summoned swarms of crows to attack from the sky, and when things turned against him, he transformed into a bat to reposition himself. The 8 fought valiantly, losing some during the fight, and desperately using whatever magic they could to save their allies. Mordok seemed unbeatable, but the 8 continued to fight. For if they fell, so too did Baldur's Gate, and eventually, the entirety of the Sword Coast would follow. Divine magic rained upon the battlefield as the cleric summoned sunlight. The druid took the strongest of beast forms, and the necromancer turned the undead against the king. Yet still, Mordok did not fail. The monk assaulted with a barrage of key-powered strikes. The fighter struck over and over with his strongest arcane weapons. Yet still, Mordok did not fall. The sorcerer used the strongest of spells, and the archer used every last magical arrow in its disposal. And still, Mordok did not fall. It was only when all 8 struck as one, using everything they had, did the vampire king falter. With a weakness found and an opening available, they struck time and time again, eventually felling the king and finishing him with a stake before he could escape to safety. Mordok, the vampire king, was finally slain. With the threat at bay, the 8 heroes looked at the heart. One of them could claim it and try to use the tower for good or evil. They could also give it to one of the factions. Instead, they each agreed to destroy the heart, ridding Faerun of the Onyx Tower for good. It is way too easy to take a look at Mordok's attack and think of only his evilness or the darkness of his hidden master. But I'd like to take a look at the other side of the equation. Mordok built himself a kingdom. He had a populace of vampires at his side. In order to follow a king, they must have had needs that were not being met. They must have felt downtrodden, only to find themselves pulled into a war for a hidden master. I've seen it time and time again. The populace, feeling ignored, marginalized, or unheard by the current government, follows a charismatic leader who promises them change and prosperity, only for that once noble message to be turned into hate and violence. Now that populace feels trapped, unable to free themselves from a choice they once made, and an investment in a better future that they are still praying will arrive. So be angry at the vampire king who lies and manipulates their followers. Don't forget that there were followers who were fooled and are now trapped. The Warden. Warden is a hooded warforged with glowing green eyes. Most warforged stand over 6 feet tall and weigh 300 pounds. Warden, however, is lean by comparison, a fact that benefits his stealthy, stalking lifestyle. Warforged are constructed from a variety of materials, including stone, metal, and darkwood. Warden was fashioned from a powerful dark metal, yet as time has passed, the metal has become tainted with a writhing, eldritch corruption. Warden wears a ragged cloak from the aboleth city of Zifu, an amulet filled with the blood of an elder evil, and an eldritch tome attributed to Pandorum strapped to his right leg. The teeth of Hadar, Warden's hexblade, is fused to their right arm, while a magical shield, etched with the magical runes and twitching tentacles, is fused to his left. As a Hexblade Warlock, Warden is skilled in both melee combat and magical assaults. They like to cripple a foe with Hex before assaulting them with Eldritch Blast, Cloak of Flies, and Eldritch Smite. When needed, Warden can also call upon Hunger of Hadar to create a void of darkness, filled with cold and cosmic horrors to assault their foes. The death of a king always marks changes in a political landscape, often resulting in war. In the world of Eberron, when King Jarron died in the year 894 YK, it started a war. What nobody expected was this war would last 102 years. This would be known as the Last War. During this century-long skirmish, countless terrifying spells and weapons were used, creating massive devastation and often unleashing new and terrifying horrors onto the world. Some were even summoned from alien worlds and extraplanar locations. During the war, House Caniff viewed this trend as the real threat that it was, and decided to do something about it. They built a massive subterranean prison meant to permanently house these horrific threats. The prison was even constructed with its own creation forge, the machine used to create the Warforge. They used this forge to create their immortal guardians of this prison. This Warforge was never given a name. It was simply referred to as the Warden. As the war continued, more and more of these horrors were locked away in the prison. Each was tended to and cared for by Warden and their fleet of Warforged. It's important to note that extraplanar horrors are cunning and patient creatures. They infect the minds of people with their corruption, and eventually turn people into crazed zealots and eldritch aberrations. So as Warden endlessly walked the prison, over and over, day after day, the outsiders began to whisper to him. They reached out with their magic and corruption, leading to his inevitable turn. The Great War ended in 994 YK. A red light filled the sky, bright enough to blind the soldiers on the field of ruin. Suddenly, a massive, magical explosion occurred, destroying the nation's sire and devastating the military forces of each side. No one knew what happened or what caused it, but following this loss, the war came to an end. The devastation of Sire was not the only event that occurred that day. A train, Sire 1313, was transformed into a mobile domain of dread, with each of its passengers believing that they are stuck on a journey that they can never hope to complete. On that day, as the world burned, the prison complex began to fall apart. The magic that held the horrors at bay had begun to weaken. Seeing their chance, the horrors escaped, destroying the prison in the process. Warden tried to stop them, but the faint corruption within them rapidly multiplied until the Warden was not the same person he once was. Most think Warforged as fully mature adults, but that is the furthest from the truth. They were created to be mature, fully developed adults, but in truth, they were young souls who didn't know who they were while struggling with the rudders of responsibility. Warforged were basically teenagers. When the war ended, Warforged were given their freedom. This meant there was no purpose and there was no orders. Everything was their choice now, and the Warforged were lost because of it. Warden was no different. With the prison gone and the war over, he had no calling. He had no purpose. He was just
empty.
When a voice reached out to the warden, offering them purpose once more, Warden readily accepted. In the world of Toril, deep in realm space, exists the Elder Evils. These are ancient, powerful beings with power and energy that could rival that of a god. Hadar, also known as the Dark Hunter, was a star-like elder evil that floated through realm space. Hadar's touch is vast and can reach across worlds. So when his eyes fell upon the Warden, an already corrupted warforged looking for a purpose, he saw a potential pact. With his dark whisper, he reached out to the Warden. He wooed the warforged with a world beyond the prison and a mission to fill that what was missing. Warden eagerly accepted, becoming his servant. Hadar offered the warforged a shadow weapon, transforming him into a hexblade warlock. Using their new magic, Warden left Eberron. They traveled across the stars and eventually arrived on Toril. Now, Warden operates in the Forgotten Realms, procuring souls for the Dark Hunger to corrupt and devour. There are studies as to how people find themselves joining cults and dark religions. Some think only the foolish and dull find themselves victims to such fanaticism. But in truth, it's often proven to be those who are intelligent that willingly enlist. What draws them to such cults and dark religion is a gap in their lives. There is some unfulfilled desire in a person, and the cult leader will always try to exploit it. Warden was a highly intelligent soul, all Warforged were. But there was a void in their lives. Without orders, without instructions, without duty or a war to fight, the Warforged were lost. Some found path in crafting, others found peace in a mundane life. But most simply roamed, unsure of what the future held for them, and not knowing what to do. Hadar simply offered the Warden a path forward, a filling, albeit a poor one, for the hole inside of them. Warden was all too eager to accept, believing his life had purpose once more, even if that purpose was a dark, corrupted one.
Lady Erebeth de Tilmerande. Lady Erebeth de Tilmerande is a half-elf woman. She has long, flowing auburn hair that touches the small of her back. She has dark green eyes and firm lips. She wears a half-plate armor with flames-shaped spikes on her left shoulder. She carries a long sword and a shield, and she wears around her neck the holy symbol of Tyr. As a blackguard, however, her eyes became red, her lips became blackened, and her armor was now stained blood red. She had forsaken her sword and board for a more brutal-looking bastard sword, and replaced her holy symbol with a magic pendant provided by Queen Morag. However, the biggest change she took in breaking her oath was that of her hair. Her once long locks had been cut short. Now, the flowing auburn hair fell only to her shoulder length. As a blackguard, Arabeth is a powerful melee warrior. She has the ability to strike at foes' weak points with sneak attack, while also punishing good heroes by smiting them with necrotic, evil energy. And if that wasn't enough, she had the ability to call on dark magic to strengthen and protect her, while inflicting great pain on those she deemed her foes. Arabeth was born in Thundertree, a small town within the kingdom of Neverwinter. She was an eager child and a resourceful one. She was trained by a Harper Ranger known as Ansal Bloodshoulder. As she got older, he gifted her with a magical ring known as the Ring of the Wood Elves. Using the magical strength of this item, Arabeth was able to protect her own town from a malicious Luskan mage at only a very young age. As she got older, Arabeth put more of her attention into her village and her training. Sadly, an orc clan raided the village and massacred everyone. Being the sole survivor, Arabeth swore vengeance. She started by hunting down the clan and slaying each and every one of them. But their lives were not enough. Unable to properly deal with the trauma of her loss, she became obsessive. She viewed Orckind as a blight. They had to be eliminated. Only then would the people of Faerun be safe. Only then would others not have to suffer in the same way she did. Succumbing to the darkness that lay inside of her, Arabeth continued her hunt of all Orckind. Her obsessive quest continued for months, until one day she was caught in a powerful blizzard. Unable to escape, she began to succumb to the cold, yet at the moment when she was about to die, a one-armed man appeared. He saved her and brought her to a nearby monastery. Realizing that her savior was most likely an avatar of Tyr, Arabeth devoted her life to that god. She began her training as a paladin. Eventually, she moved to Neverwinter, where she became the elite bodyguard of Lord Nashor Alagondar, making her not only the first woman to hold that position, but also the first non-human. It was also in Neverwinter that she met a cleric of Tyr named Fenthic Moss. The friendship between the two grew quickly, evolving first into love, and eventually they were engaged to be wed to each other. For the first time since the loss of her town, Arabeth was in a good place. Life was good for Arabeth. She was content. But all of that changed when the plague arrived. It was called the Wailing Death. It was a disease that started in the poorer districts of Neverwinter. Clerics and healers were dumbfounded as to how to stop it. The disease seemed to be immune to both mundane and magical methods. As the disease started to kill citizens by the dozen, the city was quickly put into quarantine. Everybody was in lockdown. Lord Alagondar called upon Keldin Erasun, the Blackstaff Wizard, to come up with an arcane solution, while Arabeth led the process along Fenthic and a cleric of Helm known as Dester Indelain. Now some found Dester to be off-putting, but Fenthic found him fascinating. He trusted the cleric completely, and even lent Dastardly his ward key to allow him access to the ritual. The Blackstaff Wizard was lucky enough to come up with a method to try and stop the Wailing Death, but it would require some very unique creatures. It required an Intellect Devourer, a Yuan-ti Pureblood, a Cockatrice, and a Dryad. Using his spells and his connections outside the city, he had the 4 creatures teleported in. But when the ritual was about to begin, suddenly the hall was attacked and each of the creatures fled into the city. A survivor of the attack, an adventurer who would eventually be known as the Hero of Neverwinter, set out to retrieve them. One by one, the hero retrieved each of the creatures. During this process, he began to learn about the origin of the plague. This disease was not some mundane thing that had just occurred. It was the doing of the Cult of the Eye, a malicious organization that belonged to a mysterious woman known as Queen Morag. With all of the ingredients ready, the Blackstaff Wizard began the ritual. He combined the brain of the Intellect Devourer, the heart of the Yuan-ti Pureblood, a feather of the Cockatrice, and a lock of the Dryad's hair. Together, they were finally able to create a cure to the Wailing Death. But then it was stolen. As the ritual completed, Dastardly Indolane revealed himself to be a member of the Cult of the Eye. He grabbed the cure and leapt through a portal back to Helm's Hold. Fenthic chased after the traitor, hoping to change Dastardly's mind, to revert him back to the side of good. He begged and pleaded for Dastardly to return, but the cultist was unwavering. His loyalty was only to the one known as Queen Morag. The Hero of Neverwinter was the next to follow. They faced Dastardly in combat, barely defeating the cleric and returning with both the cure and the traitor in tow. Lord Alagondar quickly put Dastardly on trial, yet even with the unwavering evidence against him, Fenthic claimed the cleric's innocent. Dastardly was not guilty. He had been compelled or corrupted. Dastardly was not at fault. They had to forgive Dastardly. Not only did these pleas fall on deaf ears, but they also turned out to be Fenthic's downfall. For when Dastardly was executed for treason, so too was Fenthic. Fenthic's death was devastating for Erebeth. The love of her life had been executed for a crime he did not commit. Fenthic was an innocent man. He was considered wise in a peaceful society, but was a fool in a more desperate reality. He was a mind too weak to handle true betrayal. Therefore, he only ever saw the best in people, a trait that had led to his downfall. The loss of her fiancé began to stir up repressed trauma that lay inside of Erebeth. Once again, her feelings of loss began to surface. First it was her village. Now it was her fiancé. Her inner darkness began to rise once more. Just like when she hunted the orcs, a murderous darkness began to bubble inside of her. That was when Queen Morag made contact. Morag was one of the Old Ones, a reptilian race that existed long before even the elves. Morag sensed the darkness within the paladin. She appeared to her in a dream and began to appeal to that darkness. How could a just kingdom seem fit to punish a simple mind for a crime they did not commit? How could a god of justice punish an innocent soul? A civilized city was meant to protect the innocent, not condemn them. Therefore, If Neverwinter could commit such crimes on the innocent, then they too deserved to be punished. Night after night, Morag reappeared in Erebeth's dreams, speaking these words over and over until she submitted. As the hero of Neverwinter began to hunt the Cult of the Eye, they found themselves atop Luskan's host tower of the Arcane. There, they witnessed Erebeth being inducted as the leader of the cult's army. Lady Erebeth de Tilmarande was no longer a paladin of Tyr. She was now a blackguard. The Wailing Death had taken its toll on Neverwinter. It had killed off hundreds of citizens and drastically weakened Neverwinter's military forces. Never had the legendary city been so frail. The city of Luskan, under the command of the cult, decided to exploit this power shift and launched an invasion. Erebeth led the forces against the very city she once swore to protect. The invasion was brutal. Morag's forces included mages, assassins, cultists, and even the entire military might of Luskan. Neverwinter fought with all of its might to repel the attacks, relying heavily on the charity of adventurers and heroes. In the climax of the battle, the hero of Neverwinter faced off against Erebeth in combat. The Blackguard was fearsome in combat. She would strike with her bastard sword, channel dark, corrupted magic into her blade, and smite the good aligned heroes. She would strike at the hero's weak point with sneak attacks and call upon a flurry of divine magic to bolster her in combat, to raise her strength to an almost godlike level. The battle was long and arduous, but eventually Erebeth was defeated. She surrendered to the hero of Neverwinter and was returned to the city to be put on trial. Lady Erebeth de Tilmarande was found guilty and was publicly executed. For most, death would be the end. A soul like Lady Erebeth de Tilmarande would be sent to the Hells to be punished, and her story would end there. However, this is Faerun. And while traveling from Faerun to the depths of Hell is no easy task, it is also not an uncommon one. Shortly after the siege of Neverwinter, another chaotic event was brewing, as it tends to do in Faerun. Mephistopheles had begun a malicious campaign to conquer Toril and transform it into a new layer of hell. Opposing him was a hero who once held the title of Drogon's son's pupil. While traveling through Cania, the 8th layer of hell, the pupil came across the soul of Erebeth. Now time runs differently in the Hells. What could only be a year for us could be decades for those being tortured. So when the pupil found the former paladin, they found her in a broken and distraught state. She had spent her time running through her feelings and dealing with her trauma. She had seen the error of her ways and wanted to join the pupil in stopping Mephistopheles. She wanted to make amends. She wanted to be redeemed. On their travels, Erebeth told the pupil of how the hero of Neverwinter defended her, even during her trials, and how her death and execution ruined the relationship between the hero and Lord Nashor. And during the entire time between the trial and her imprisonment, and even up to the days before her execution, Erebeth spoke how she had begun to develop feelings for the hero of Neverwinter, and they too had developed feelings for her. This is partially why she wanted to be redeemed. Without it, she could never be reunited with the hero of Neverwinter. When the pupil and Erebeth faced off against Mephistopheles, the archdevil did his best to woo her back to the side of evil. But Erebeth would not be budged. She fought alongside the pupil until Mephistopheles was defeated. With that victory, she was a redeemed paladin, and she was able to go to Mount Celestia. There, she awaits to be reunited with the hero of Neverwinter. It is not often I get to talk about a redeemed villain. Sadly, many who fall off the path of good never find their way back. Especially when trauma is involved. Trauma is such a powerful thing. It's what happens when our minds experience something that they're not ready to handle. Trauma is very much like a slad. Now, for those who don't know, and this is not a pretty sight, slads reproduce by placing their eggs beneath the skin of their victims. There, the egg sits, slowly devouring our insides until it becomes a tadpole, before it rips out, tearing us apart. Trauma is very much the same way. Lady Erebeth had suffered a great deal of loss in her time, and she was never fully able to process it while she was alive. She let that trauma just sit inside of her, eating her up over and over. Had she been able to properly process it, perhaps she wouldn't have fallen to Queen Morag's influences. Perhaps she could have found peace in her life instead of death and war. Perhaps she could have found love while she was still alive.
Thembershad, the wormsmith of Gracklestug. Of all the dragons that exist in Faerun, the red-scaled ones were the most feared. They were highly intelligent, vastly brutal, and incredibly cruel. Their greed for gold was only topped by the sadistic pleasure they got into manipulating other dragons into giving up their hoards to them. The red dragons were Tiamat's favorite children. They embodied the worst that dragonkind had to offer. To most, the worst sight imaginable was the image of a red dragon gracefully soaring through the air, breathing fire down from above. Thembershad wasn't a typical red dragon, though. While he had the same scales, red like lava, and he had the same eyes that glowed a bright yellow, there was a major difference that separated him from the rest of his kin. He was fat, and I mean very fat. Thembershad was a vastly overweight dragon whose size dwarfed any of its kind. He had a massive round gut and struggled to take to the air, let alone fly. Just for comparison's sake, the biggest of the great worms grows to roughly 35 feet in length and weighs an average of 5,000 pounds. Thembershad, however, measured 21 feet long in just his head alone. And some rumors
Well, they put his weight between 12 to 15,000 pounds. Themberchaud was not an intelligent dragon. Okay, he was far more intelligent than any humanoid, and infinitely smarter than any white dragon. But when compared to his red brethren, he was just a simple-minded worm. He enjoyed feasting, sleeping, and growing his hoard. He was still prideful and vain, and his ego was so big that he considered it impossible that someone would not agree to his orders. On the rare occurrence when someone did disobey, he simply burned them and carried on as normal. He was a dragon who mostly spoke in Dwarven, often believing that his draconic tongue was far too great and superior for the lesser races to hear. Themberchaud spent most of his days sleeping, feasting, and contentedly watching over his self-appointed domain. Now, why does that sound familiar? No, of course I wasn't talking about you, Vega. Not at all. To speak of the history of Themberchaud requires us to look at the history of Gracklstugh. Deep in the Underdark, in a region known as the North Dark, is Gracklstugh, the City of Blades. It was a cavern city and a subterranean port. Alongside its Duergar population, the city acted as home for the insane Darrow, the fiendish half-breed Durzagon, stone giants, and even the orcs. Gracklstugh had the largest military force in all of the Underdark, but lacked any significant number of arcane or divine casters. What they did have, however, were their great forges. Gracklstugh had hundreds of smelters and foundries located amongst the stalagmites. The city's air was smoky and filled with haze, and it echoed with the industrial sounds of fire, steam, and the near constant sound of iron ringing. The city was known for superior quality weapons, outstanding armors, and legendary swords. They were also known for their superior arrowheads, their exceptional mining and smithing equipment, and tools whose quality was so great that even the drow sought them out. When they weren't at war with each other, of course. Those legendary achievements in crafting were only achieved by keeping the flames of their forges at an incredible heat, a feat accomplished by the breath of a red dragon, otherwise known as the Wormsmith. Deep in the city's district was the lair that now belonged to Themberchaud, the Red Dragon. Themberchaud was hatched within his chamber in Gracklstugh. He was the latest of the Wormsmiths, and a descendant of the previous one. From a young age, he was put to work, walking around the city and using his fiery breath to ignite the forges, all while his every need were being met. In exchange for his fiery breath, the city gave him gold and treasure for his hoard, and slaves for him to feast upon. It was a life of decadence and hedonism, both aspects that Themberchaud enjoyed. Within the city, the dragon's needs were tended to by the keepers of the flame. They obeyed his every whim and defended his lair from a nearby guardhouse while he was on his rounds. They kept him content through persuasion, appeasement, and even speaking on his behalf to others. This was the deal struck between the Worm and Hogar Steelshadow IV, the king of Gracklstugh at that time. In truth, the Keepers had a much darker agenda. In order to join their order, one must have proved that they had skills in psionic manipulation. Each member was part scion and part cleric. It was their job to keep Themberchaud under control. Using their strong mind magic, they would enter his mind and twist it until his thoughts matched their own. They had been doing this to him since before the day of his hatching. For years, Themberchaud was content with his existence. He patrolled the city, ignited their forges, and then reveled in his hoard and grew fat on the city's more disobedient slaves, of which there must have been a great number, judging by his size. He had even been called upon to defend the city in the middle of an attack. How startling that must have been to witness. Let me just paint you a picture. Hobgoblins have invaded the city, accompanied by bugbears and goblins. Their forces number in the tens of thousands. Through trickery and guile, they have breached the perimeter and stormed into the city's center. Every goblin's face is filled with murderous glee, and every hobgoblin is filled with the sense of pride that comes from a cunning military victory. They see a dark cave and decide to approach. Suddenly, the glowing yellow eyes become clear, and a burst of flame lunges out from the darkness. An entire platoon vanishes in mere seconds, burned alive and turned into ash. Emerging from the cave is the largest dragon they have ever seen. Its gut is gigantic, round, and bulbous. The dragon waddles forward with hunger and rage in its eyes. Platoons either freeze in disbelief or immediately turn tail and try to flee. But Themberchaud is already angered. Using great effort, it takes to the sky and unleashes another tongue of flame. Breath after breath, it burns away the invaders until their numbers are so small that the Dugar no longer need his assistance. When the battle is over, Themberchaud is found once more in his lair. The sound of his heaving gasps echoes across the city. The dragon is clearly out of breath, but content as he feasts once more on goblins. As the dragon got older, he grew stronger and more restless. He had developed a resistance to the psionic intrusions of the Keeper, and had become very discontent with the limited supply of food and gold being offered to him. New ideas began to brew inside of his mind. Thoughts of controlling the entire city began to percolate. He knew there was much the Keepers had kept from him, but he had decided to watch and observe before confronting them. He watched the city's affairs, taking notice of the Keepers' bid for power and their war with the city's thieves guild, the Grey Ghosts. As the political drama began to unfold, he began to recruit agents of his own, granting each of them a golden badge that let them walk within the city unaccosted. Themberchaud's actions did not go unnoticed. The Keepers of the Flame had become aware of his restlessness and his desire for power. It wasn't uncommon for a red dragon to grow into their sinister and manipulative nature. This was when the Keepers would normally slay the Wormsmith and replace it with a newly hatched youngling. But their plans had been waylaid by those meddlesome Grey Ghosts. The thieves had broken into the Keeper's lair and stolen the dragon egg. Left without a replacement, and unwilling to have the forges go silent, the Keepers continued to deal with Themberchaud. A campaign of espionage began between the two factions, as agents from each stormed the Grey Ghost compound in search of the egg. Fights between the two broke out, and battles occur, but the egg was eventually found by Themberchaud's agents and returned to him. Content in his victory, the red dragon instantly smashed the egg. forever cementing his position within the city. As his cold war against the Keepers of the Flame continued, bigger events were occurring within the Underdark. Deep in the darkest corners, several demon lords were set free upon the material plane. The event was known as the Rage of Demons, and it rippled across all of Faerun, its aftermath causing great chaos and spreading a demonic madness. For Gracklstugh, the battle weakened their numbers and pulled their already divided attention even further apart. This weakness allowed for a mind flayer to enter the city. The Duergar's latest ruler, Hogar Steelshadow V, had succumbed to the demonic madness, and the mind flayer saw opportunity. He took advantage of that weakness and dominated the city, even using its psionic assault to invade and subdue Thembershad's mind. When the Order of the Burning Dawn, a collection of surface-dwelling do-gooders, entered the city looking for the fabled Moon Tear, they came across the Mind Flayer and eventually slayed it. Thembershad, now free of the psionic assault, bestowed upon these heroes the greatest honor the Red Dragon could think of. He didn't eat them. While the Rage of Demons has long since ended, there are still some who think its effects still exist. There are rumors that say Thembershad was not himself. They say that the revered dragon had been possessed by a demon lord. Frankly, I find the idea kind of humorous. Suddenly a force like Demogorgon or Kratz has arrived on the material plane. It possesses a powerful red dragon, only to find itself sitting around, eating, and getting fatter. Okay, perhaps that's right up Gratz's alley. Despite the belief that he could never escape, Thembershad is no longer in Gracklstugh. He has departed the city and now resides in a new location within the Underdark. He resides in the hanging city of Dolbunde, a gnome city. It is unknown how or why the Red Dragon left Gracklstugh, but due to my more recent, let's say, cinematic research, I have learned that the Rotund Dragon now lives in a new lair. Did the Keepers of the Flame find a new dragon? Did the deal with the Steel Shadow clan finally run its course? And have the Forges finally run silent? The interesting twist, however, is that Dolbunde was once home to a different dragon, Dargothoth. Dargothoth is a black Dracolich and a powerful archmage. He is viewed as one of the most powerful creatures in all of Faerun, with power and magic that may even rival the lesser gods. So how did Thembershad come to live in the Dracolich's lair? And where's the Dracolich now? And what will happen when the Dracolich comes home? The story of Thembershad is a tragic one. It is a story of abuse, manipulation, and malicious grooming. Thembershad was born into subjugation, his child mind manipulated and twisted by his captors. Now, as an adult dragon whose age is well into the 400s and bordering on 500 years old, he has finally freed himself from the toxicity that was his life. Red dragons are far from the moral standard by which we should abide, but even they do not deserve the tragedy that has become of such a childhood.
while I shudder at the thought of the chaos and suffering that Thembershad can cause on the surface. There is still a part of me that wishes that one day he finally gets a chance to see the blue sky that he so often dreams about, and perhaps even clumsily fly amongst it.
It seems that our tea has once again run dry, which means our time is up. Join me again in my library for more stories and lore about the darkest villains from the darkest realms. This has been the Dastardly Decimal System, and once again, I am your librarian, Castor Cain.